And, okay. All right, we're live. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And this afternoon or this evening or early in the morning, wherever you are in the world, we're delighted to have our good friend Sulari Gentill back with us to discuss her new novel, The Woman in the Library. And it's available in hardcover and in trade paperback. And we don't have signed copies yet, but Barbara's going to go over this. Sulari is going to be coming through town in October, so we can hang on to a copy if you'd like, or have you send your book back, or we have options to get signed copies. So as always, I'm going to be monitoring the comments field. So if you have questions for Sulari, go ahead and put them in at any time throughout the hour, and they'll summon me back on screen, I don't know, quarter till, something like that. I'll be happy to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Well, first, Sulari, a toast to you and to our book. I'm so excited to see it in print at long last.
I'm absolutely delighted. It seems like it's had the longest gestation, this book. I feel like I've been writing it for years.
Well, we were actually working on it way back when we were writing, let me think. I know that when we were editing When There's a Will, which is your 10th Roland Sinclair mystery, which coincidentally is set in Boston, that we had a conversation about it. Do I have some weird vestigial memory that at one point this book was connected with Kansas?
That's another book. So that was the book I was writing when the idea came to me for that book. So you've read the Kansas book as well, and that's been put in abeyance because this book took over.
Got it. Okay. So anyway, in the course of working on When There's a Will, which is a title I suggested to Sulari, but ripped off from Rex Stout, actually. It is the title of a Nero Wolfe novel, but it absolutely fit the 10th Roland Sinclair, which is Sulari's series set in the 1930s, which is marching along slowly through the course of fascism in Australia and in fact around the world towards the war. And I'm just going to add that one of the things that I have learned working with Sulari over the course of all of her books is how much I didn't know, and probably many of you didn't know, about how Down Under was affected in the 1930s, because we're so Eurocentric. I didn't think many of us ever gave a lot of thought to communism, fascism, and all of those troublesome and horrible issues going on in Australia. And was it to a lesser extent New Zealand, Sulari? Was it really more an Australian thing?
It was more in Australia. I think New Zealand has a smaller population anyway, so I presume that they would have similar echoes, because those sort of conflicts seem to be happening all over the world in different guises. So I presume that they had their own version of it, but they're a smaller population, they're a rural population, so I presume it didn't come to a head the way it did in Australia.
So the Roland Sinclair books, which are wonderfully eccentric, and Sulari and I have had numerous headbuttings about how the relationships. I keep wanting her to go one direction. She assures me in Australia it would never fly. So, I've had to give up. But in any case, they are wonderful books if you're a fan of Jacqueline Winspear. Anne Perry has loved them and endorsed them. Rhys Bowen has loved them and endorsed them. So if you haven't discovered the Roland Sinclair mysteries, then you should. But Sulari wrote a book published in Australia, which won its Best Mystery, the Ned Kelly Award, which is basically the Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best Mystery, for a book that published called Crossing the Lines, but in the United States is known as After She Wrote Him. And it was a book that everybody wrestled to describe. And I had to look up metafiction in order to sort of get a handle on it. And Jeffrey Deaver, who wrote one of the truly great metafiction novels, I can't remember the title, but It All Travels Backwards, he loved it. Dean Koontz, out of the blue. Actually, do you remember that? Dean Koontz read it and volunteered an endorsement for After She Wrote It. So that was your first, Sulari, that was your first sort of, what do we want to call it? Hall of Mirrors, sliding door, authors within authors, and our characters real? Who's real in the book is a big question.
I remember when you first sent me a note after I sent you that manuscript, and you said it was postmodern. And I'll admit I had to Google postmodern to find out what exactly that meant.
I probably had already Googled it.
And so it was that after she wrote him was, I suppose, my foray into writing about writing. So, you know, they always tell you to write what you know. And I've never followed that. With the Roland Sinclair series, I always followed that I wrote what I was interested in as opposed to what I knew. But in the process of writing the Roland Sinclair mysteries, I came to know a little bit about writing and how a writer's mind works. And I got to sort of, you know, I think it was about book 7 when I wrote that book. I had written 7 books in the Roland Sinclair series. And I felt this compulsion to talk about writing and that strange, unique sort of netherworld that writers enter into when they start talking to their characters.
Which is fascinating. One of the things we'll talk about in a little bit is the writing process and how Sulari describes how it works in here. We can talk about the sort of writing the bus theory. But before we go any further, let me just straighten out a couple of things. The book is coming out in both hardcover and in large paperback. We in the trade call it trade paperback, but it's just like a large paperback. And both of them are for sale now. Because we know that Sulari is going to come to the Poison Pen one way or another. And actually, I've just been talking to her about perhaps being our 2022 writer in residence, because that program went into abeyance during COVID. It's a program that Diana Gabaldon in the Poison Pen, we do it together. Anyway, we can save, but we're going to charge you now, but hold your copy of the hardcover, the paperback, till October. And the reason we have to charge you now is that the hardcover is going to disappear. It's going to reprint. So the first printings, which are the valuable edition, are going to go up like smoke because this book has had such astonishing reviews and publicity. So we're going to have to buy it now and then keep it until Sulari comes to see us. So if you go to our web store to buy it, be careful that you click on the paperback versus the hardcover. Because it's easy to confuse them because the covers are identical. It's really just the price on the web store that will give you a clue as to which is which. And I do think, you know, I like that design, Sulari, for publishing, but it really can throw readers, I think. Basically, the paperback is for people who just want to read it, and the hardcover is for people who want to keep it, want to collect it. It's for libraries, whatever. It's just how publishing works. So it's exciting either way. I also want to ask you, do you have a copy of the Australian book there? Because it has a very different cover.
This is the Australian.
Right. Cover. I saw it. And you had an Instagram post and I thought, how interesting. Look at the difference. I mean, there's a woman, because after all, look at the title. But I do think that the treatment is quite interesting. And publishers do decide, you know, what will work in their own market, and there's no necessarily transfer. In fact, the reason Sulari and I got together was that at the Frankfurt Book Fair, I walked through a small selection of Australian publishers, and she had at that point, what was it, like 3 or 4? I think it was 4 Roland Sinclairs. And the cover was interesting. It didn't necessarily grab me, but it was interesting. And so I looked at the back and I thought, I love this stuff, you know, love the 1930s, love it all. Yeah. But we were in a hurry and I let it go. And then the next year when I came back to the Frankfurt Book Fair, they were still there. And I thought, it's a sign. It is the sign that I need to buy this series for Poison Pen Press. And so I did. And, you know, it was one of the best things I've ever done, Sulari. Thank you.
I was thinking about that this morning, and, you know, all the sliding doors that happened to bring me to you and to make this, The Woman in the Library, come to be, because it was written as the dedication says, for you. I had no intention after she wrote him of writing another metafiction, but Barbara had been so engaged with that book, and I had enjoyed working with her so much. I wanted to write something for her. So that book would never have come into being if it hadn't been for my relationship with Barbara. And I was just thinking, what would have happened if Barbara hadn't walked past that book that day at Frankfurt, or if someone else had picked it up in between when she first saw it and when she second saw it. And I like to think, because it scares me how easily things could have gone off track, I like to think that it was always meant to be, that Barbara was going to be my editor, and I was going to end up with Poison Pen Press, even though I seem to take a circuitous route towards it.
I've often felt that too, Sulari. When I went back that second year and I saw the book still there, and I felt like it really was a sign, that if it was still there, therefore still available, that I'd be an idiot, not to pick it up, that it was clearly meant for us. And I'm so delighted. I really love the Roland Sinclair books. But I have to say that after she wrote him and now The Woman in the Library is a completely different reading experience. So I guess we've kind of touched on the reason that you, an Australian author, would have set a book in Boston, and more particularly to part of it in the Boston Public Library. But tell us about your friend in Boston, because you would have been hard pressed, and so would I, because I don't live in Boston, to get all these details right without your friend.
So I knew I wanted to write a book for Barbara, but at the time I was writing the Kansas book. And the Kansas book sort of takes place in Lawrence, Kansas, but it also, comes into New York and so on. And because I wasn't there, and I think at the time I started writing it, I hadn't even made the 2019 tour. So I'd never been to New York. I'd certainly never been to Lawrence, Kansas. I'd never been to Boston. And so I had a friend who I met in Australia at a Sisters in Crime event, but he's an American writer. And his name is Larry Vincent, L.M. Vincent, and he's a nonfiction writer. And he had always said to me, whenever you're writing in America, feel free to pick my brain. And I took him up on it, and I picked his brain for the Roland Sinclair book, the number 10, which was set in Boston. And then as I was writing the Lawrence, Kansas book, I was picking his brain as well. And he happened to be in Boston at the time. He was researching his own book, which I think is called A Theft of Privilege. And I was writing to him, and he was sending me back information. But Larry is a much, much better researcher than I am. Because he's a nonfiction writer, he goes to lengths that I would never think of going to. So not only was he answering my questions, he was sending me maps and bus timetables and menus. He was giving me suggestions of where people might eat. And he started taking footage of the sidewalks in Boston, because he thought I should see that, some of them are cobbled and so on, and what it looks like in the snow. And then one day there was a murder about 2 blocks from where he was staying. And he thought it would be really useful for me to know what coroner's tape and coroner's vehicles and crime scene tape look like in America. So he went down there and he took footage of the crime scene after the body had been removed, but he took footage of the crime scene. And I was sitting in Australia, and this email comes in from Larry, and I open the file, and it's footage of a crime scene. And my husband, who happened to be standing behind me at the time, said, "Gosh, I hope Larry's not killing people so that he can send you research." And I'm pretty sure he wasn't. In fact, I'm certain he wasn't. But I did think at the time that it was a really good idea for a novel. And so I just started. I mean, and as you know, Barbara, I don't plot, I just write. And so I just sat down and I started writing Dear Hannah. And the novel just fell into place from there. So it often seems like that with my process. It's something needs to spark, and then it just catches, and the ideas sort of fall into place after that without me really trying or plotting or thinking in any great way.
So Winifred, who is actually the fictional person in this, well, everybody's fictional, but more fictional than other people in the book, she has a similar writing process, so we'll talk about it. But one reason I wanted Sulari to mention her friend in Boston is Leo, who is a key player in this book, indeed is sending Hannah, who is the author living in Australia, all this material from Boston. And I thought, you must have been processing what your friend sent you, because you detail, a lot of the stuff that he's sending. And so basically what we have is we have Hannah in Australia, who's going to write a novel set in Boston. And we have Leo, who is sending her material to use or doing research and so forth. But then we have Winifred, who is the character in the novel Hannah is writing, and three friends, and the book is unfolding. So the question is, and you have to be careful when you read it, who's telling the story at what time. It's and Leo is there by email almost to the very end.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
that part helps. And then Hannah replies to Leo. But then we have Freddie, Winifred, and that whole story moving forward. And Sulari sets herself a real challenge in this book, because you describe it. I mean, what happens when they are in the library, and all the way through the book, we keep wondering how you were ever going to resolve it. And it's hard for me to imagine that you didn't have some idea how you're going to get out of the corner or the box that you built for yourself. But in fact, she actually does at the end. She'll be happy to know. So set up the scene in the library for us, because it's so cool.
Okay, so I knew that I had Winifred, who was in Boston on a very prestigious writers' fellowship, and she's writing her first book, so it has to be worthy. And so she's sitting in the reading room of the Boston Public Library, and she's doing what I would probably be doing. She's staring at the ceiling, thinking, gee, that's a nice ceiling. And then she sort of lowers her eyes to the people sitting at the table with her, and she doesn't know their names, so she gives them little monikers. So the young woman sitting beside her is reading Freud, and so she calls her Freud girl. And the young man sitting across from her is wearing a Harvard College jacket, and so and he's got a very classically cut there's face, and so she calls him Heroic Chin. And the gentleman sitting beside him is starkly handsome, and so she just refers to him as handsome man. And so she's trying to actually just make up backstories for them. It's almost like a writing exercise to get herself in the mode for writing her novel. And it's while she's doing this that a scream rings out through the reading room, and it's a terrified mortal scream, and everybody knows that it's not a joke, that it's something serious, that something awful has happened. And everybody stops, and the security guards come in and tell everybody to stay where they are while they investigate. But nothing's found, nothing at all. It's almost as if the scream came from nowhere and disappeared into nowhere. But in that process, because they are stuck in the reading room together whilst someone's running around looking for a body, the four people at the table start to talk. And a friendship is founded where otherwise they may have just passed each other and gone on with their lives. At the end of that chapter, Winifred says, and Winifred's narrating this in first person, she says they go off for coffee at the map room, and she says, and so I had my first coffee with a killer. And I had no idea where that line came from. That's just what she said. And I remember looking at that thinking, now I have let everybody know that one of these four people is a murderer. And I'm going to have an interesting time playing cat and mouse, so that it isn't incredibly obvious who the killer is, but also it has to be one of them. I can't pull someone in from elsewhere, but the scream happened while all four of them were sitting at the table together. I had no idea how I was going to resolve that. I had absolutely no idea which one of them it would be. And I had absolutely no idea how I was going to keep it from being incredibly obvious to the reader who it was, except for the fact that I didn't know who it was. So, and I suppose that was part of the challenge. I did stop. I do remember stopping at that moment thinking, do you really want to do this? But I kind of have this mad policy of just forging ahead and seeing what'll happen. And so I just kept going. And it seemed to work. It seemed to fall into place. And I am it's the same with the Roland Sinclair novels. This is the way I write. I don't know who the killer is usually until about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the book. And then I always get to that point where I think, oh, I've written myself into a corner. How am I going to resolve this? And what I've done in the past and what I did with this book is just to keep writing and hope that it all comes together. And it hasn't failed me yet, I don't think.
No, it doesn't fail you. Actually, you up the stakes, because after there's this terrible scream and security comes and everybody runs around madly, there isn't a body. So,
Yep.
The next question is, if in fact the scream was of somebody in mortal terror or fear of their life, then where is the body? That's a major question, in crime fiction, is it's hard to move forward in a murder investigation without habeas corpus, so where is the body? So you added an extra challenge there, and I'm thinking she's never going to pull this off. I mean, and then, an extra question is, which we're not going to answer, is that it is one of the four. But in an age of really unreliable narrators, is in fact Winifred, who's narrating the story, is Winifred, in fact, the murderer, having coffee with herself? I mean, we can't trust you 100% on that.
Well, I mean, and that's, I suppose that's part of it. When you're a crime fiction writer, ultimately the author is always the murderer.
True. Now that you mention it, that is true. But she's not the author. I mean, she is.
No, she's not the author. It's Hannah.
No, Hannah's the author. Winifred is her creation, but Winifred is narrating. What we're seeing is Hannah's novel coming to life as Hannah is writing it, and we're getting input from Leo. So basically, everybody has an agenda. Leo has an agenda. Part of his agenda is that he has a manuscript and he is an unpublished writer, and he's hoping that Hannah will refer him to her agent or some useful thing will happen. So he's not completely disinterested in doing her research project. Hannah, who has this prestigious fellowship, and Sulari, in fact, is a person who has had, if not a fellowship, although maybe you have had, but you did have the grant to come to the United States with the other authors, which is the time you visit us in November 2019. Sulari and 3 other Australian writers had a grant from Australia to come to the United States, go to the Big Mystery Convention, BoucherCon in Texas. Then they all came to the Poison Pen. And then in a moment of total insanity at like 5 or 6 in the afternoon, they all decided they couldn't leave without driving to the Grand Canyon. And I'm going, no, but they actually did it. I mean, that's why I think we should have a novel set in Arizona that will be completely lunatic based upon the 4 lunatics that went to the Grand Canyon. But moving aside.
No, we didn't actually drive to the Grand Canyon ourselves because we thought we couldn't do it. We didn't know the roads well enough. And there was a couple who came to that event at the Poison Pen who overheard us talking about it. And they picked us up at 8 o'clock in the morning, drove us there and drove us back. And it was just such a beautiful example of American generosity. I remember we were talking about it at the time. It was just such a lovely thing to do for people who were basically total strangers. But there was the crime writers in us, as we were standing there waiting for them to come up in their cars, thought they could be taking us away to kill us. And dump our bodies.
No kidding. Well, I obviously my memory is somewhat confused because I thought you had taken off that night after our event at the store, but this makes much more sense that you went.
It makes much more sense. We went in the morning and came, and they drove us there and back, and and it was everything. I'm so glad we did it. I'm so glad it's I don't know that anyone can actually describe how phenomenal the Grand Canyon is and the sheer size of it. It's, I think I described it once as like looking into time. It was just it was an experience that if you have the chance to have it, it's not something that should be passed up, even if you could be getting into a car with serial killers.
It is actually looking into time. You're absolutely right from a geological standpoint. I will add that my younger brother, who got a pilot license and had a little plane for my 50th birthday, which was a long time ago, that was my birthday present. Is we flew up in his little plane and he flew me all the way down the Grand Canyon and all the way back, which you could do 30 some years ago. You can't do it. You might be able to do it again now, but I don't think so, because there's been grief that has attached to people doing that. But we digress. Anyway, let's go back to the book. So everybody has an agenda. Hannah has her fellowship, and she has to write a book that's going to be worthy of the fellowship. And then we plunge into the story. And Winifred has an agenda. She wants to be writing a book, and we're not entirely sure what the other three people, who turn out to be named Cain and Marigold and Wit, we're not entirely sure what their agendas are and their backstory. And so that's part of what we learn as we move along as to who these people had these name tags that Hannah gave them. We know that handsome man turns into Cain, and Freud girl turns into Marigold, and is it the chin turns into
heroic chin becomes Wit, yes.
Right. And so as we're moving along, all these agendas are advancing. But as we move along, Sulari tells us a great deal about her idea of the writing process. So now that you've heard this conversation, you will see that Winifred's method of creating her novel is very much Sulari's. I'm not entirely sure that Hannah's is. Is Hannah, do you think, of the same ilk?
No,
She seems more controlled.
You don't actually hear anything from Hannah. All you see is the chapter that she writes in response to Leo. And it's interesting, a lot of people read the book and they think they've heard from Hannah directly. And I suppose in a way they do, because you can find an author in their work, and the choices they make, who they give you as a protagonist or a hero, who they cast as a villain, the obstacles that they throw in their way, and the way they write a story gives you, I think, a really good insight on who a writer is. So I think readers picked up on that when they were reading Winifred's story. That's all they heard from Hannah. They didn't hear anything else. You never saw her response to Leo except for those chapters. So I suspect that Hannah is a little bit more controlled, but she is getting feedback from Leo. And I do see a point at which she changes where the story is going as Leo starts to become a little darker as an advisor. So in the beginning, Leo is everything you could ever want from a colleague and a fan and a friend. He's so enthusiastic about her work. He's willing to help. He's really flattering. And then at some point that becomes a little bit different. It becomes like a control. And so in the beginning, it's their colleagues and their friends, and she's respecting his opinion. And then at some point, he starts to get a bit dictatorial about his opinion and his demands about where her book should go. And that's kind of a process that many authors have been through with fans who become friends, or fans who you have an extended correspondence with. There's often a point at which you need to sort of pull back and reclaim your story, because really enthusiastic fans can sometimes get a little bit too invested in where they think the story should go. So I did want to play with that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It's also a problem for editors, I might say, that, it's very difficult sometimes. I've never really forgiven myself for a very cruel thing I did, but it was entirely by accident with an author who had written a perfectly marvelous book in which an opera diva was a major character, and it was set in Atlanta. And it was very much about people of color in, that Atlanta is basically the New York for that and so forth. But at the end, the fate of the singer, he didn't know enough about opera to know that it was the wrong fate. And
Yeah.
I should have just shut up, but I was so invested in the story and I loved it so much up to the moment when, he didn't
Yeah.
do and I told him about it. And I think it was just the worst thing I've ever done in ways. I ruined it for him, because I was right, but it
Yeah.
was too late to fix it. And it was his story. And it really, Sulari, taught me a lesson about editing that I've tried to respect, which is, it's not my book. My job as an editor is to help your story come out. And, it's easy to get heavy handed as an editor and think, where it goes. And sometimes the only time it ever was okay was and an author we took from another publisher, and he was a wonderful writer, but he wrote a book, and no matter how, he just wouldn't listen to advice. He absolutely was determined to finish this book, even though I did everything I could to persuade him. Marilyn Stasio reviewed it in the New York Times, and basically her review was, he should have listened to his editor. I always remembered that. I was so mortified. But at the same time, I thought, okay, now how do I find the balance between, saying, no, this is not the path to go, and, no, this is your book. You should do whatever you want with it. And, I'm just here to facilitate that. So it's not an easy role, being an author, being an editor.
But I think you have found the perfect balance. I don't know if you remember in After She Wrote Him or There's Crossing the Lines, there was a problem with the ending.
Yeah.
And I knew there was a problem, and my agent knew there was a problem, but none of us could work out how to fix it. And you looked at it, and in the space of 30 seconds, you said, you need a conversation there. And then everything just fell into place. And that's, I think that's the value of a really good editor. It's not, you didn't tell me what to write or what the conversation should be. You just said it needs to slow down, a conversation there. And I could write it. It could still, it wasn't, I didn't feel like I was being told how to end my story in any way. I felt like I was being told how to make it better.
Well, you and I have an interesting symbiosis, I think, that is not often achieved, but when it is, it's wonderful. So let's talk about a couple of other things. That in a very hypersensitive market, there are two things that are generally said about American and British fiction, and by British, we could also say to some degree Australian, which is basically Americans are obsessed with race and the British are obsessed with class. But in this book, Sulari actually deals with both of these tropes, both with race and with class, in a very interesting way. And I guess a question for you, Sulari, would be, do you think it was easier for you to touch on the race issues because you are, in fact, a woman of color? Would you,
I think so.
you have felt there would have been some kickback if you weren't?
I think, look, I don't think I can deny that. I think that's real. I'm not even sure I would have had the courage to touch on race issues if I wasn't a woman of color. It is a very sensitive topic, and it's fraught. There's so many people who are so invested either way in how it's portrayed and how it's written. And, literature has become really caught up in that, about who can write what and what can be said and what hijacks a story. And so there is a real difference in the way Australians deal with race and the way Americans deal with race. And I did want to talk about that. It felt to me like it would be cowardly to completely leave that out. But I didn't want the story to be hijacked by that. I did want to talk about it, but I did want to talk about it in a way that people listened rather than people took a position. So whenever you're talking about something like race or something like class, where people have very deeply held positions about what they believe and what they see, talking to them in a way that's going to make them back into their corner is no use to anyone. All it's going to mean is they're going to stop reading your book, and you're not going to change minds if that is your intention. You're not going to let the story flourish. You're not going to even plant the seed if that's what you want to do. So I think the challenge for writers now is to find a way to address this, not just now, always, is to find a way to address these topics in a way that engages rather than alienates. And so that's what I hope I've done with The Woman in the Library. I certainly tried to do it that way.
I thought you did it really well. I mean, it does come up at some point, do we assume? I can't remember if it's Leo that asked Hannah, I've forgotten exactly how it comes up. I think that's it, about whether, do we assume that these 4 people sitting around the table in the Boston Public Library are all white Brahmin or just white Bostonians? Or, could some of them in fact be, Black Bostonians or Asian Bostonians or what? So, is that automatic assumption? But where the class part comes in is when you talk about the community, because class very often in America is defined by where you live. In Britain, in fact, there's a new book out about, for Americans about how to translate class in terms of the British sensibility to it. Part of it's language, part of it is, what you show up for, there are a whole lot of rituals and, understood things in Britain that if you don't know about them and you don't observe them, then you've automatically put yourself into a different class because, it's like the cool kids in high school have their, they already have their, so if they show up and they're all in, like white socks or something, and the not cool kids don't get the message and show up in something else, then right there it's. But I thought the way you dealt with class in this book by talking about where people could live in Boston, the kind of house they live in and the part of Boston like Roxbury versus something else. I thought you did that really well, and you didn't hit anybody over the head with it, but it comes out in the same way that assumption is that, are all these characters similar or do they come from different backgrounds, comes out very well.
I think, it's a funny thing that default to white that exists in Western literature is pervading. I mean, I default to white and I'm not, and there's no reason why I should. But for some reason, if I don't consciously stop myself and think, why am I assuming that everybody here is white? I do it. So it's not necessarily a racist thing. It's obviously just a cultural thing that people have this default. Australia is a funny sort of place in that we don't have the class issues, or we don't have the class set up as strongly and as ingrained as Britain or even America, because the Western part of our civilization, which is where class comes from really, is very young. We're only a couple of 100 years old. So there hasn't ever been that establishment of the upper classes and this that has happened in the UK and to a lesser extent in the US. It does exist to some extent, but it's really not a very strong and pervading issue here. So I find it really interesting as an observational thing. Australian class systems, and I wrote about it in the Roland Sinclair books. They're more subtle. They're just a bit. They're more archaic, and they're more easy to break through than they seem to be in other countries. But certainly we have our own race issues, but they're different. And it's always surprised me that race issues are so different between the UK and the US and Australia.
You do on page, because I marked this because I wanted to mention it, on page 15, and this does come up, as you say, in the Roland Sinclair books, but Winifred here is talking. And she says, I smile remembering Margaret Winslow from the board of directors of the Marriott Scholarship, who was so proud of being a 6th generation Australian. Now, that's very much like the Daughters of the Revolution. That's a colonial kind of experience. But then you go on to say, which I think is an excellent point, in the country of the oldest living civilization in the world, some 60,000 years of indigenous history, 6 generations seem to pallid boast. And, you know, Australia has a pretty brutal relationship with the, what you want to call them, Aborigines, but anyway, the native population has been hideously treated in Australia. And, you know, we certainly did the same thing here to our native population. Canada has a very unhappy relationship with what they call First People, I think it is. So all these colonial powers, you know, take pride in how long they've been in whatever the country is. But in point of fact, they are the immigrants, they're the invaders. But I hadn't really stopped to think that Australia, 60,000 years of Aboriginal history. I mean, that's remarkable.
And in fact, it's now been extended to 70,000 years since I wrote that book. So it's they found more evidence that that it was longer than they thought. It's remarkable and it's beautiful. And for such a long time, we didn't understand Aboriginal culture. And because, you know, the Indigenous peoples of Australia are not one tribe, they're many tribes. So they're not one nation, they're many nations. Much like the Indigenous people of America. We tended to just, you know, there's in the past, Australia, you know, just regarded them as Aborigines. They were one. In fact, you know, our constitution classed them as fauna. So that's how bad it was. But there's so, you know, we have a long way to come and a lot of recompense and a lot of things to make up for that 200 years of Western civilization, for what we did to our native peoples. But I think one of the things that I noticed when I was in America is that is recognized in Australia. So we don't ever begin, say, a meeting like this without recognizing the land on which we stand. So if I was speaking in an Australian Zoom, I'd start off by saying, you know, I'm Sulari Gentill. I'm on the lands of the Wiradjuri people. I extend my respects to elders past and present. And when we were in America and we were touring, it felt weird to start events without that acknowledgement. And I presume that, you know, in America you had native peoples who once owned that land. So it's a kind of thing that has a almost direct parallel.
Actually, not far from the Poison Pen is, in fact, land still owned by the Pima Indians. There is a Pima Indian reservation just a few miles east. So, you know, what we've done is create these reservations that, you know, that people were put in, and now in places like Oklahoma, that's beginning to break up. But one of the major Indian populations in Oklahoma, the Cherokee, were marched there from North Carolina. And that was a tragic thing. So, you know, the whole history of it has been awful. And I think all of the Americas have had a colonial experience, and Australia too. So you can't, I think I really like the way you pointed that out. Let me also say that there was a sentence on page 34 that really caught me by surprise. Opening sentence: "Dear Hannah, I think I may be in love with Marigolds. She's probably driving me nuts in person, but on the page she's luminescent. She steals the scenes." Now that is Leo writing to Hannah about a character that Hannah's created. But in addition to addressing race, did we assume that all these people were basically heterosexual? I mean, we didn't, you know, gender is another question that is such a hot button at the moment. And here in America in June, we are actually celebrating what they, you know, Gay Pride Month. And I've learned some new vocabulary words. One word I learned the other day: dead names. Do you know what dead names means?
Yes, I did. I do know what dead names mean. And that, I mean, that's it's a tough way to regard it. And I can understand it from one perspective, your dead name is what you were in the past and what you move onto. A little part of me is a little bit sad for a parent who gave that name with love, to have that referred to as a dead name. I understand, but I'm a parent, and if one of my boys decided that they were transgender, I would support them and love them and celebrate that with them. But I would be really sad if they. I wouldn't be sad if they changed their name. I'd be sad if they thought that the name I gave them with love was dead. And so I can sort of, it's one of those things when you have, the world is changing and we're becoming more open. We're coming to understand people, and we're coming to allow people to be themselves. But that process, like every process of change, can be brutal to the old world as well. So yes, I have heard the term dead name, and I can understand why people who have changed regard their old self and their old name as that. But a little part of me flinches a little bit whenever I hear
I had
that.
the same reaction, and but it just wasn't a term I had thought of. But the reason I brought it up is that we have these four people: Winifred, Cain, Wit, and Marigold. And my natural assumption, not only did I think they were probably all white because they were in Boston, the Boston Public Library, but I assumed that there was going to be any kind of romantic relationship. It would be a heterosexual one, but in point of fact, it could have been just as easily Winifred and Marigold, or Cain and Wit or something. And so I'm thinking, that we readers bring assumptions, in fact, to reading the book. And I wonder to what degree, it's up to the author needs to think about that or clarify that, or just not care about that and let the story develop as it wishes to.
I think as the story developed, when I was watching the way they were interacting, I did wonder whether Marigold was in love with Winifred at some point. And it turned out that she moved towards Wit, but she could just have easily have moved towards Winifred at the time. And the character did what the character did. I've never considered Marigold as particularly heterosexual. I just thought her character was such that whatever she fell in love with would be what she fell in love with, and it wouldn't make a difference. But yes, I understand there is that, and I think it's part of it is a tendency to assume everybody's like us unless we're told they're not. So if you're heterosexual reading a novel, you assume everyone's heterosexual unless you're told they're not. But that's an assumption. Just like if you're reading a book, you assume everybody, if you're white, you assume they're white, unless they're not. Though the white thing seems to be unusual because I'm not white and I tend to default to white too. And I have to, as I said before, I have to consciously remind myself that that's ridiculous. But so it seems to be something that's just caught up in the tradition of literature, and it's changing. And I think that's, it's just part of the evolution.
And crime fiction was really basically a British and an American construct way back. And now I'm really happy to see that it has gone all around the world, and we are seeing, Danish, Swedish, Romanian, Japanese have gotten hugely active in writing mystery. So it's become a worldwide literary interest, genre, whatever you want to call it, which I think is great. But for some of us, especially older readers like myself, we still tend to think in terms of those original.
Of course. And if you grew up on a steady diet of Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie, it's no wonder that you wouldn't default to white characters of a certain class and of a certain sexual persuasion, because that's who they all were. So coming at the cusp of a change, of course, there's going to be, a little bit of adjustment that's necessary with both readers and writers. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think you're always on the cusp of some change or another. It's,
Right. No, I find it fascinating, and I think it speaks a lot for your book that it has provoked these questions or, these reactions. And I also, there was a little, your book was featured in, I think, the novel Suspects, which is a sort of roundup of things that come along. And they thoughtfully included a link to several other mysteries which were set in libraries. And it made me think about, it's not just mystery, but there are fantasies set in the libraries, there are, romances. There's a whole thing for readers about the, publishing, writing, libraries, books, the whole bit. It's like, it fascinates readers. So I'm also thinking, you didn't have to do this in a library. I mean, they could all have met in the bar and,
Yep.
like Robert Parker, didn't. So why did you pick a library? Could have been a restaurant.
I wanted to write. I wanted to write a book within a book, and I was writing about constructions of stories and the way the outside world influences what goes into a story. And it seemed really natural that that you would open that book in a place that's really a vortex of books or a vortex of stories. It seemed like almost the perfect place to set a book within a book, and this whole notion of stories tumbling into the one thread. So I thought about this story as, the thread with Leo and Hannah, and then the thread with Winifred, and then also the book that Winifred was writing, and as three separate things that were being braided and plaited together. And so it seemed like going to the place where stories are kept and housed and respected and loved seemed like the perfect opening. So it was it was as simple as that. There wasn't any particular grand plan to, incorporate shelving or anything of the sort. The other thing was also that at the time when, when I got the message from Larry about the crime scene, he was also spending most of his days writing in the reading room of the Boston Public Library.
Right.
So I have this fanciful need to believe in the stars aligning, and it seemed to me that was what was meant to be.
Well, libraries are repositories of wisdom. Their books are considered magical. I mean, if you think of books, many like religious conspiracy books and so forth, the thing they're always looking for is a book or a document. Occasionally it's a relic or something, but most of the time, knowledge was passed on once we got to writing by, in books and documents, and they take on a not only sort of a sacred quality, but a very civilized quality. So there's a shock, the body in the library, the Agatha Christie book that so many people, it's that shock of the uncivilized in a place that is, sort of hallowed in terms of civilization and knowledge. How can there be a murder in a place that is like that? But the other thing is that the library really works as like the Agatha Christie country house for your book. You need to have a closed environment where only X number of people can be, in fact, suspected of the murder. So the library works in the same way that, as I said, a country house or, variations on that, a theater, or everybody's on an ocean liner or something. You have to limit your field of suspects or the whole thing gets completely away from you. But the way this story works, which we're not going to tell you, but the way the story works, it really takes something like the library to make the resolution of this crime plausible. And it does, despite what may sound to you like some woo-woo stuff here. It does actually, it is plausible. And I'm so impressed that Sulari got there with her non-linear, non-outlining process, although there is a glorious thing in the book where somebody who does follow the sort of Jeffrey Deaver obsession, with outlining and all, creates a kind of giant spider web in which to write, by having actual string, I think it is, or something, you know, connecting all the points, which I really love, and which is a great contrast to Winifred just kind of, you know, riding along on the bus. So you do a
Well,
nice job talking about creative process and how different it is for different people.
Well, I've always slightly envied the plotters because, you know, it always seemed to me that it was a very writerly thing to have a plot. It seemed like a beautiful piece of furniture almost to have a plot that had, you know, strings and connections, and, you know, you got to use beautiful notebooks. I'm a obsessive buyer of beautiful notebooks, but I don't take notes. I just sit down and write. So I have, you know, 50 odd empty notebooks on my shelves, and I sort of have this yearning to have the product that a plotter has, you know, the beginnings of a story, the skeleton of a story that's in there. So it was lovely to write Kane's method that way, because it was almost a sort of a wistful writing of Kane's method, because I don't have it. I can't do that. But the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking about libraries is that there's something quite timeless about a library. And that makes sense because a book is really a conversation with the future. And so a library as a repository of books and stories is capturing the past and the present and talking to the future. And every publisher, every writer will tell you that what they aspire to is to write a story that's timeless. Mm-hmm. And that's a tricky thing to do while you're still, you know, dealing with COVID and BLM and all the things that are going on in the world. But a good start is a library.
Absolutely. And at this point, we should bring Patrick in before we run out of energy and time. Patrick, come join us. I love the way he pops up here. There he is. Do we have any comments or questions, or we stunned everybody?
There are a few, not as many as I would hope, but okay. Let's see. Teresa says, you might have already spoken about this, but why Boston?
So this, yes, I did speak about it. Well, this Boston was basically that Larry was there at the time. So when he sent me the message and the crime scene footage, it was from Boston, and I could see that I could just take his letters because we were corresponding at that time, you know, daily about work and about writing. That they gave me a great source, a great this vat of material on which to draw for this book.
Plus, Sulari and I had already been working on a book set in Boston in her Roland Sinclair series, so we were already deeply into Boston when the whole thing happened.
I haven't been to Boston yet, but I'm dying to go to Boston to see, because it feels to me like I've been there now. I've written.
Yeah, I'm sure it does.
And I want to see whether it matches up. I almost feel like I've walked down the street. I've walked down Mass Avenue, and I've been to the Boston Public Library, and I've been to Harvard Square, and I've sat in the Brattle. But I haven't, of course. It's all just happened in my imagination. So it'll be really interesting to go there for real and to see whether I did it correctly.
Let's see, a couple people are asking about this. Renee asks, Sulari, is Piggy sleeping through the night yet? How will you train Piggy to find truffles?
Piggy's sleeping right next to me. So anyone who has been following me on Facebook knows that I spent all morning trying to exhaust her and tire her out so that she would sleep through this event, because she's, you know, 3.5 months old, and she's noisy and you know, likes to cause as much havoc as possible when you need her to be quiet. So, you know, I got up this morning and I ran her. and I fed her, and I ran her, and I took her out in the cold so that when she went back into her warm bed that she would sleep quite happily. Training her to find truffles is just simply scent training. So she's an English Springer Spaniel, so she is naturally nose down, so she looks for any good smells anyway. So when this, all I have to do is find a way to tell her that the smell I want her to find is that of truffle.
She really is down for the count, isn't she?
I did well.
You did well.
I did well.
Let's see here. What else do we have here? Well, our good friend Hank Philippi Ryan is tuning in.
Uh,
And she's
Hi,
saying
Hank.
she loves the book. Let's see here.
And she lives in Boston, even more important.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ba, ba, ba. Okay, yeah, Valerie asks, thank you so much for this. What's up next for you, Sulari?
What's up next? I'm actually finishing up the book that I was writing that I abandoned when the idea for The Woman in the Library came to me, and it was pretty much finished before I abandoned it. But it's one of those books that doesn't make sense post-COVID. So I do have to rewrite it a little bit to actually take into account how the world has changed. So there's a great argument for making things timeless and for ignoring COVID and writing a story as it is, but our understanding of the world has changed after what we've been through. And so a writer has to take that into account. There's the Roland Sinclair series. There's book 11 to finish as well. And there's ideas that kind of pop up all the time. So you never know what is going to ignite along the way. And I was, and just before this session, I was talking to Barbara about a book set in Arizona, which sounds very exciting. So I'm already starting to play with ideas.
Both of us are already starting to play with ideas. That's for sure. One of the wonderful things about Sulari having written after she wrote it, aka Crossing the Lines, or The Woman in the Library, is that she's already done things outside the series for which over which we met and for which she was known for a while, and that gives her an opportunity to pursue different kinds of novels, because only a few, there's a very specific set of ideas that will fit the Roland Sinclair books, given, their time period and the cast you've already got and so forth. So Roland Sinclair could not have been, the protagonist. That group could not have been the people that we meet in The Woman in the Library. So I think it's great that Sulari has established herself as a novelist of considerable range already, which gives her the freedom to do that.
It is always a challenge in publishing, isn't it? When you become known as a writer of a particular type of novel,
yeah.
It's always a difficulty to jump into another type. So having done it, I suppose it's given me a key to the other kingdom that I can sort of cross over when I need to. But for me, it's always been about what story takes me at the time. I've been very indulgent as a writer. I've written the story that's actually obsessed me at that moment, rather than thinking long term about what I should be writing. And I think that's probably how I'm going to continue, because I suppose the way I write, I need to be obsessed with the story for it to come to me, because I have no plot to fall back on.
Right. Well, so far it's worked out pretty well for you. So let's not break your pattern for the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else,
Yeah.
Patrick?
Well, Teresa would like to know, what are you reading right now? Anything really good?
What am I reading? Yes, Benjamin Stevenson has a wonderful book called Everyone in My Family Has Killed Somebody. I'm reading that at the moment and enjoying it immensely. It's also metafiction. So funnily enough, you have two metafictions books released very close to each other. So I think it's released in the US. It's certainly released in Australia. But it's again very meta and also very, very funny.
Excellent.
Yeah. The only other things that I'm getting a few last minute questions here. Lisa Holstein, our good friend, is tuned in, and she's just saying how much librarians are excited about The Woman in the Window, or excuse me, The Woman in the Library. I bet they are. Yeah. Renee, maybe as a good final question, Renee asks, have you always wanted to be an author?
No, I didn't realize. I had no idea. I I went to university to study astrophysics. And the reason I went to university to study astrophysics, when I was a child, when we first migrated to Australia, we came from Africa. So we came from very temperate Zambia, and we landed in Melbourne, which has very, very, very hot summers. And we had this little brick veneer box in the suburbs, which was, no insulation, no fans, no air conditioning. And at night in Melbourne in the summers, it doesn't get any cooler. And so we were being baked in this little in our house. And what we used to do is we used to trot out onto the lawn, the entire family, and sleep on this newly planted lawn in this new suburb and look up at the sky and just lie there because you couldn't sleep in the house. Couldn't really sleep on the lawn either, but it was more comfortable. And we'd stargaze. And in those days, you could still see the stars from the suburbs of Melbourne. And my father would tell us stories. That were written into the constellations. So the stories of Eridanus and the Dioscuri and so on. And it was one of those memories that I forgot until much later in life. But I always had this feeling whenever I looked up at the stars of feeling thrilled and inspired and absolutely in awe. And I thought that that meant I should be an astrophysicist, which is why I trotted off to university to study astrophysics. And in that first year, I discovered that my professors seemed to think that, my wonderful constellations were just stars or balls of gas, and everything could be described by mathematical formula. And I realized that what I had fallen in love with was the stories that my father had told into the stars, as opposed to the stars themselves. And you would have thought that at that point, I would have realized that perhaps I wanted to write, but I didn't. I was obviously particularly obtuse adolescent. And I just thought, oh, well, then I'll just do law. and so I became a lawyer, and I was a lawyer for about, I think 10 years. And I was, perfectly happy being a lawyer, but I was one of those people who became a serial hobbyist. So I'd pick up these crazy hobbies, do them intensely for about 6 months, master them, move on to something else. And I started writing in exactly the same way. I had, done ceramic doll making, and I'd built grand walls, and I'd learned how to pregnancy test cows, and I'd finished the welding course. And I thought, oh, well, I need to keep occupied. I'll write a novel. But it was one of those things that as soon as I started, within hours of writing or starting to write, I realized that this is what I should have been doing all along, that it was as natural as breathing, and that I suddenly felt like I was breathing properly for the first time in my life, and that I wasn't ever going to stop. So that's kind of how it happened. And then I sort of wound back my legal practice, and I've been writing full time ever since.
But if you hadn't had those experiences, you wouldn't be the same writer that you are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Everything. The wonderful thing about being a writer is everything you ever did before and everything you're doing now is material.
That's really true. I mean, that's why it's so rare to find a really sensational 20-year-old novelist. I mean, occasionally one sort of comes along, but the truth is you just haven't had enough life experience most of the time. So you could write objectively about something, but it's very hard to. And in this book, the way Sulari creates the lives of these characters, I mean, it isn't just their reactions going forward from the body in the library, the woman in the library, the screen, but it's who they are, who they were, their whole lives coming up to this moment. And that's hard to do if you haven't had any kind of life of your own to create lives for other people.
Yeah, I think it's something that I suppose you don't understand when you're 20. If you'd asked me that when I was 20, I would say, of course I understand people, but you don't. And there's something about, well, I didn't. There's something about the years that actually sort of age the way you look at things. And I think they make you more able to look at things with perspective and to look at things from a different perspective. Certainly the law honed that for me to look at things from the other perspective. But I also think that I like to think that over the years I've become more tolerant, kinder, and I think that helps you write a better story because you're not so judgmental of your own characters. You let them be who they are, and that allows you to write a more complete human being rather than a character that's been judged and pushed into a straitjacket of that kind of certainty that you have when you're 20 as to how people should be.
That's a really excellent point. And I will add, since Sulari and I both have had legal training, that one of the great things about it, whether, she's not practicing law and I'm now a bookseller, not a lawyer, but what it does is it's a problem solving thing. And it gives you confidence. If you have trained in the law, it gives you confidence that you can, in fact, solve problems as they come along. And it also, it's forward thinking. So even if you are on the bus kind of, dicking your way along through your story, you still, because of the legal training and so forth, you still have confidence that eventually the bus will get to a destination and, that you will be able to solve the problems that you have created. It also teaches you a lot about storytelling, because I can tell you that especially in court, the best story will win, regardless of the facts, regardless of the evidence. If you have a jury, I'm telling you that the best story will win.
I agree. And even if it's not in court, when you're even talking to human beings and negotiating. So my particular expertise was in negotiation, and I used to negotiate huge contracts, energy contracts for millions and millions and millions of dollars, and stories were absolutely invaluable then. You could persuade people with stories. You could put them into shoes. And so I think the law is one of those professions that actually does teach you about the power of storytelling, and it does allow you to hone that ability.
I agree entirely. Well, that's one reason, as I said, Sulari and I get along so well. Anyway, it's really been a joy to spend some time with you. So, Sulari, thank you very much. Patrick, thank you for doing the hosting. This is truly an amazing book, and we definitely recommend it for a reader of any stripe, because there's so much to unpack in the book. And it's a wonderful way of looking at the world as it is, and perhaps the world as we wish it were. So, bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Good night.
Thank you.
Or in your case, Sulari, good morning. Enjoy the rest of your day.
The puppy's just waking up.
So are mine. I can hear them thundering at the door.